So, we're here today talking to Jess Montgomery, the author of The Widows and her follow-up book, The Hollows, and you have a third book on the way. Is that right?
I do. I turned it in about 3 weeks ago.
Oh, that's
And
impressive.
thank you. I haven't gotten edits back, so we'll find out how impressive my editor thinks it is.
Yeah. So, what's the title of the third book, or is that a secret?
It's not a secret. It's going to be called The Stills, is what we're calling it right now. We wanted to keep the and a plural noun, but realized that hopefully this series will go on for a while. And after a while, you kind of run out of rhyming names and they blur together. So it was actually a suggestion my editor had to call it The Stills, because I delve even more into prohibition and all of that in the third book than I have in the first two. And of course, the word still can be evocative of so many things, not just moonshining stills.
Well,
So,
that's very clever. Well, I have to tell you that I first of all really appreciate your taking the time to chat about this. I thought The Widows was an amazing book.
oh, thank
It's
you.
it's a mystery. It's a historical novel. It for someone who grew up in Ohio and spent many years there. It had that sense of familiarity to it. And it's also telling, I thought, that it set in what 1924, 4 years
Hmm.
after women won the right to vote. We're in
That's
the middle
right.
of Prohibition. We're in
Hmm.
coal country. Things are
Hmm.
pretty rough in coal country.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, one of the two main characters in the book, a woman named Lily Ross, is suddenly named sheriff when her husband's murdered, and the story takes
Yeah.
off from there.
Right.
Yeah, talk a little bit, if you would, about how you came up with the idea for this
Hmm.
story. What kind of research you had to do to drop back in time 100 years, and
Right.
put all this together.
So the idea kind of found me in a way. Our younger daughter went to Ohio University, and she majored in outdoor recreation and education. And she also happened to be a rugby player. She still plays a little bit now and then in adult rec leagues. But I am not an outdoorsy type, and I definitely don't play rugby. It's a workout for me to even watch her play rugby. But we wanted to kind of treat her to going somewhere where we could hike, all the three of us together. So I just did Google research on where can we hike in southeastern Ohio, and happened across the Vinton County website, and they happened to be featuring Maud Collins, who really was the true first female sheriff in Ohio in 1925 when her husband was killed in the line of duty. And in real life, there's no mystery about how Maud's husband, Fletcher, who killed him or why he died. He was simply trying to serve a warrant for somebody's arrest for, of all things, a speeding ticket. And the person that he was serving this warrant to just killed him in cold blood. There were tons of witnesses. So there was no mystery at all. But I had some things going on with my family of origin that were disturbing to me. And I just was really inspired by this picture I found of Maud Collins, how strong she looked and yet how tough and beautiful and smart. And I thought, how would she deal with if she were a character and she didn't know who killed her husband? How would she deal with that emotionally? How would she deal with the desire for not only finding the truth but vengeance? How would she deal with that sense of being separated from her community, and heal enough to reconnect with community? And those were sufficient questions. Those are big questions, and and then incidentally, we did find a place to go hiking that worked for all three of us. Uh, so that's nice. But those were big enough questions that I could sort of figure out her character and then what was driving the plot, and build from there. Yeah.
So it was a journey of discovery for her,
Yeah.
including the history of her husband that was revealed to her after his death.
Right. Right. Yeah, and that partly came from just the creative process of putting the story together. She couldn't know him as well as one might want to know one's partner and still have it be a mystery, right? So that was
Right.
part of it. And part of it is married relationships were very different, I think, 100 years ago than they are now. I've had readers, especially female readers, say, well, her husband, he doesn't talk much about his emotions, and he seems like really tough and brutal. And I'm like, he fought in what we call World War I and was a boxer, and it was 100 years ago. I think I made him pretty sensitive for the time. And yet he was a man who had a close female friend who was a friend from childhood, Marvina, who's inspired by the Unionizer Mother Jones. So between Lily and Marvina, they're the two narrators of the story. They figure out who this man, Daniel, was and why he was killed. And then they have to go from there to decide what they do with that knowledge at the end.
So these two characters, these two very strong, very different women, did you have a sort of a completely evolved sense of who they were when you set out to write this story, or did they kind of speak to you as you were going along? To a certain degree, that speaks to the writer's process. Did you have all this figured out in advance, or did it kind of just come to you as you were writing?
It was a very messy process. I'm not going to lie. At first, because I've written other books, and I wrote a column, as it turns out, for 10 years. There was a humor column, and all those books in that column were in the first person. So I feel this, I do this, so forth. And so that was the voice I was used to writing in. And at first, I tried to write Lily, the main character, and the widows and the hollows, in first person, and it just didn't work. And so I thought, okay, I need to write her third person, past tense. And that felt so removed that I ended up switching it to third person present tense. And then I realized that she just wouldn't know enough to figure this out by herself. And of course, it's set in a town called Kinship, which is a made-up place, but is also symbolic of kind of what I'm trying to get at with the overall series, that notion of community and kin and whatnot. And so that's when I thought, well, I need a second character that will share this narration with her. And to be honest, I'd written, and talk about a messy process, I'd written a lot of pages, about 90, from Daniel's point of view. I look back and I think, that was my cat, by the way. I look back and I think, I can't believe I did that. I wrote 90 pages of this poor man and doing flashbacks as he's dying. It's like the opera, like, and one more thing. And then I realized, no, this does not work from from the book for the book. And it just didn't work. But what emerged from trying to write from his point of view and his memories was Marvina. And honestly, she just sort of showed up on the page. And I thought, who's this? Why is this girl crawling out of the creek and being rescued by Daniel when they're like teenagers? Who is she? And I just started brainstorming, well, who is she? And I realized, she slowly kind of emerged. She's the one character, I have got to say, she just sort of showed up and said, hi, I am going to be a part of your stories and you cannot get rid of me, which very much fits her character. She's a really tough, strong, emotions right on her shirt sleeve, raw kind of woman. I love her.
and she does. She shows up in town after Daniel's funeral, and it's like the classic stranger comes to town, and there you go. Yep. You've got conflict. You've got all this stuff boiling up suddenly with the arrival of this person.
Yeah, not fun.
Well, yeah, it is fun. So it sounds like it was an entangled creative process. How long did it take from start to finish to pull all this together?
Honestly, The Widows took about 3 years, which is a long time. And each book since then has taken about 1 to 1.5. But I think it took so long partly because, like I say, I switched from first person to third person. I have written historical fiction before, but the 1920s is a whole different world. You can write about the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, and you can kind of pull on people's memories, or if you're old enough, your own memories. I was born in the 60s, so I could write, I can think vaguely back to the late 60s, for example, or I can think about stories my parents told. But when you're writing about people who are adults in the 1920s, now you're in a completely different era. And Ohio in the 1920s, especially rural areas, was it's a different world. So that was part of what took me so long. And then part of it was trying to figure out what the story was really about and wanting to honor that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it took a while. I didn't immediately say, I'm going to write a story about the power of community and the ways in which it saves us and the ways in which it betrays us both. And by the way, I'll be clever and I'll name the town Kinship. It was just this sloppy process that eventually I kind of realized what I'd created. And then honestly, it took an agent and an editor to say, do you understand what you've created? I think you're a little close to the feeling of this book. You don't understand what you've created. Let us tell you. Which is why it became a series. I initially wrote The Widows and said, oh, that was great. That's done. I'm done with that world. I didn't think of it as a series at all.
Huh.
Not funny.
Yeah. And I have to say that as a reader, and you hear this about truly successful books like this, it's truly transported to this world that you created. And when you think of the 1920s, you think of the Roaring Twenties, you think of, more of an urban setting and flappers and bathtub gin and speakeasies. But this was more like the Wild West. I mean, it was very unruly. You had these thugs hired as Pinkerton agents, keeping these bedraggled coal miners in line. You have this nascent unionizing movement trying to, come to surface. You had a lot of brutality, and it's in this mix that this woman finds herself in this position, something she never would have dreamed of. But it felt so real, and it was like, wow, is that what it was like? Talk for a second, if you would, about, because we are talking about the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. That had just happened right before she became sheriff. What kind of parallels do you see between the world of the 1920s and the world of 2020 that we're in now?
I see a shocking number of parallels, actually. In some ways, we feel like we're so evolved, and we are, from some modes of thinking. And yet, like with the Me Too movement, I mean, it's 100 years later, and women are still wanting to be respected as individuals and as full human beings. There's still a divide between. I have an older daughter who's in the military, and the reactions I get about her serving in that way, it's always interesting to me, because I think I would not get those reactions if she were a son. So there's still this sort of view that's kind of baked into our culture of what women can and can't do, and what's surprising and not surprising. So I think that's still there. And then there's definitely workers' rights. I mean, like you say, the unionization movement was starting to grow then. I come from a long line of tobacco farmers and factory workers, and my father was a machinist and ended up having his own shop. But, the working class experience and the value and the need for unions was a big deal. It was a big part of our our kitchen table conversations in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But, we think about the gig economy now, and how folks are looking for, a lot of people are, piecing together, I'm an Uber driver, and also I write ad copy, and also I do this and I do that. And by the way, where's my health care, and how do I get insurance? And so those are the same sorts of considerations, just changing the job titles and and the way and the terminology that we use. And it was interesting in writing the Hollows, the follow up to the Widows. There's a lot of concern in that book about mental health issues, and of course they would have used very different terminology in the 1920s than we do now. But it's still a concern. So, and you touched a little bit on something I would like to expand on about how. When we think of the 20s, we think of the flappers and the jazz clubs in the cities, and those are definitely part of the 20s and a great part of the 20s. But that's only a small percentage of what people experienced. And it was really hard to research what was life like for people living in rural areas, very rural areas in 1925. I ended up going to the town where Maud Collins, the original true first female sheriff, lived, and reading newspapers, yay newspapers, to just see, what was advertised, what was for sale at the grocery, those kinds of because it was really hard to figure out day-to-day life. And then I drew a lot on just stories because I was always the kid who was annoying her grandmother and her great-grandmother about, tell me what it was like when you were a kid. And my family are all from Appalachia. So I drew on those stories to kind of figure out, well, this is the experience my great aunt would have had, or that my great grandmother would have had, and pull that in. And then I also spent a lot of time wandering around that part of Ohio, and I talked to some retired coal miners who wouldn't have been born in the they might have been born no, they wouldn't have been born then. Yeah. These gentlemen would have been a bit older or a bit younger. But, they shared stories from their experiences with me as coal miners, and then stories that they heard from their fathers and uncles and grandfathers and great uncles about what it was like to be in those mines. So that's where I pulled it all from. So thank you. I'm glad it felt real.
It did feel real, including the dialogue. And I was going to ask you about research, but
yeah,
that just leads directly into that. I mean, how do you capture the sense of how people actually spoke, the phrases they used? Is that from other books? Is it from newspaper articles?
No, it's from my family of origin, and it's interesting because I'm the first native Buckeye, the first Ohioan from either side of my family. And so I would be teased about that, which was fine. But then I was also teased occasionally by classmates who thought we talked funny because my family were Appalachian, from Eastern Kentucky. And when, a big holiday would roll around, or the occasional weekend, even though, my parents were part of the great diaspora north to work in the factories. And so I was born kind of late in their lives, which is one reason I'm the firstborn Buckeye. I have younger cousins who were later born up here. But they would say, oh, we're going down home. Mm-hmm. And that meant going to Grandma Lou's house, in West Liberty, Kentucky. And so I grew up hearing these ballads and these gospel songs, and my grandmas from both sides teaching me these songs, and learning how to barter, and learning how to can, and learning, old stories. And, my father had that accent, and my grandmother had that accent. And so when I started, because I wasn't born there, I felt like, I can't write about being Appalachian because I was born in Ohio, in the non-Appalachian part of Ohio. But when I started writing this, I mean, it sounds corny, but I felt like, I'm going home. I can't write this. And so the dialogue just kind of came very naturally. It was my great aunt Cassie's way of speaking. It was my Aunt Opal's way of speaking. So it felt very comforting. I've cited a couple of aunts and grandmothers and great grandmothers. They're also the inspiration for Lily, because I come from some really strong women, and I thought they would be. That's who Lily. They would be like Lily. That's who they would be.
Wow.
So.
Well, we have the Widows, the Hollows. We're soon to have the Still.
Yes, the Stills. Mm-hmm.
And what's next for Jess Montgomery? What have you got queued up after this?
Well, book four. I'm contracted through book four.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And so I
okay.
have no idea what book four will be. um, but it's interesting to pull from um, very specific pieces of history from the 20s. So in The Widows, we have, you know, some events in coal mining territory that, like, cite, for example, the Battle for Blair Mountain. That one was news to me because I only had a couple uncles who were coal miners, so I had to do a lot of research about coal mining. So I kind of pulled from that, and then the Hollows I pull from some sort of shocking history, I think, about the WKKK, and then in the Stills, I pull from history about Prohibition. So and that one's set in 1927, which is a fascinating year in Prohibition, actually. And so the next one, I don't know. I can't decide if I'm going to just throw them into the Great Depression, skip ahead a couple years, or exactly what I'll do with them. But poor things, they think it's great right now. The economy's great in their year.
You're about to torture these poor characters you've created.
I know, poor things. I do feel bad about that, but you know, but
Living
not
with
too.
guilt, living with guilt builds character, right?
That's right. That's
Right.
right.
Okay. Well, Jess, thank you so much. Once again, we've been speaking to Jess Montgomery, the author of The Widows, The Hollows, The Stills, and yet one yet to be named novel,
Right.
all set in the 1920s. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and good luck on your third book and your fourth book in process.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Thanks for being with us.